Arizona Court of Appeals upholding the state's controversial voter ID law after the Department of Justice said it discriminated against minorities. At the same time, though, they struck down the provision requiring proof of citizenship. Judge Andrew Napolitano, Fox News senior judicial analyst, joins us here on the set. Good to see you. This is a curious ruling. Yes, voting is racially polarized, and yes, Latinos are discriminated against, but the ID law is okay.
Well, the Justice Department argued that the effect of the ID law, that is, having to physically show a government-issued ID at the time you vote, would suppress minority voting because a lot of minorities, for whatever reason, don't have a valid government-issued ID.
Right.
And the law of the land is, if a state does something that disparately suppresses a minority group or affects a minority group differently than it affects the majority, then the law arguably violates the 14th Amendment.
Sure.
But this Court of Appeals, the most liberal federal appellate court in the country, said there's no significant evidence of disparate impact. The Justice Department was just making a political argument, and the state has the right to have you show your ID. Why did they say that? Because the Supreme Court of the United States has basically said that's the law of the land. If the law is neutral and just intended to secure the soundness of elections, and if there's no evidence that this is adversely affecting one racial group more than another, the state can require you to present an ID.
And that was a 2008 U.S. Supreme Court decision involving Indiana. And the Supreme Court upheld their voter identification law. In fact, it was Stevens who wrote the decision.
A liberal, now retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. Now, there's the other half of this.
Which is you do not have to show proof of citizenship. You can just show up and say, I attest to it.
Okay. So Arizona says to those who register voters, you shall require proof of citizenship. That doesn't mean verbal assertion that one is a citizen, but some documentation that one is a citizen. The Ninth Circuit says, well, you can't do that. Because in the Clinton years, in 1993, a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president enacted a statute that superseded state law.
Federal law trumps state law.
Correct, and said all you can do is ask if the person is a citizen. And if they say no, they don't vote. If they say yes, you then ask the other questions, like where do you live and how long have you lived here?
But it's under penalty of perjury, right?
It is under penalty of perjury. But what this means is a federal court is saying a federal statute trumps the ability of the states to assure that only citizens vote. That is an issue ripe for Supreme Court review.
All right, let's put up on the screen. We have some brand new Fox News polls on this very issue, voter identification. 70% say it's needed to stop illegal voting. Just 26% say it's unnecessary. Are Americans right about that? It may be a minor inconvenience, but it will eliminate voter fraud and impersonation.
Well, not only is there an overwhelming majority in favor of these type of laws, but there's an overwhelming majority on the Supreme Court and in federal appellate courts saying when it's done in a neutral way, it's absolutely acceptable and the inconvenience is de minimis.
Opponents say it's an attempt to disenfranchise minorities and the poor, and thus giving the Republican Party an advantage in local elections.
You know, I didn't know this, but every state in the union will give you an ID whether you have a driver's license or not. It looks like a driver's license. It has everything on there like a driver's license does, but it doesn't authorize you to drive. But it does prove who you are. And you use this when you go to the TSA, when you go to the airport, and now in many states when you go to vote.
And that was Stevens' point, wasn't it? He suggested the outcome, though, could be different in a state where voters could provide evidence of their rights being impaired. Doesn't happen very often. Right.
Now, the flip side of this is, if the Justice Department does find that there's a disparate impact, that not enough poor people can get these IDs, and that the ID requirement is suppressing the vote of an identifiable class, then the courts will intercede. But there was no evidence of that in Arizona.
Judge Andrew Napolitano. Always learn a lot
from
it's a pleasure, sitting around hanging out with you.
You ask great questions, my friend.
Thank you very much, Judge Andrew Napolitano.
That was a good one.
Oh, yeah. That's a